Let's look at some more anatomy of the eyeball. So there are three layers, and I'm not going to go exactly in the order of the terms on the left. I'm going to do it in my own way. You have three basic layers of the eyeball. You have what's called the fibrous tunic, which is composed of the sclera and the cornea. Those are the outermost surface of the eye. So the sclera is white, the cornea is clear. It's actually all the same stuff, it's just the molecules are arranged in a different way, such that the sclera is opaque, but the cornea is clear. So that's the outer, the fibrous tunic. It's really tough stuff. It's designed to protect your eyeball from physical injury. Underneath is the choroid layer. The choroid layer is heavily vascularized. It's got lots of blood vessels. That's actually what you were seeing with the flash and the red eye. As the choroid moves around towards the front of the eye, it then turns into, there are lots of different names for what's going on here. The ciliary body is actually composed of a few things, and I find that students get mixed up if I use that term. So instead, I use the term ciliary muscle. The ciliary muscle is part of the ciliary body. It is a muscle. It's a smooth muscle. And it grabs a hold of these things called suspensory ligaments, which some people call the ciliary zonules. The suspensory ligaments in turn grab a hold of the lens. And this is how you can change the shape of the lens in order to focus on objects that are close up, all right? So the muscle contracts, it pulls on those little strings, and then that changes the shape of the lens. That's accommodation, ability to focus on close-up things. Then the choroid continues and turns into the iris, which is also a lot of muscle tissue. It's the iris either dilating or constricting that causes the change in the size of the pupil, all right? I mean, I didn't use the words correctly, but it's the pupil that dilates and constricts. The iris muscle either contracts or relaxes, all right? But in other words, it's the iris that controls the pupil size. So that's the whole choroid layer. Then there's the retina. This is often called, the choroid, by the way, is often called the vascular tunic. Tunic is an old word meaning kind of like a shirt, like in medieval times, underneath your armor. So we have the fibrous tunic, that was the sclera, and the cornea, coronavirus. And then the vascular tunic, which was the choroid and all that other stuff I mentioned, ciliary muscle and the lens and the suspensory ligaments and the iris. And then the nervous tunic. This is where you actually have nerve cells. This is the retina. So the retina lines the posterior part of your eyeball, and that's where you detect light. And it's neuron type of cells in the retina that then the axons of the ganglion cells bundle together, and they actually make the optic nerve. Now, the retina doesn't come all the way around the complete inside of your eye. It eventually stops, and you can see there's that jagged line right there. That's the ora serrata, serrated like a steak knife, serrated, all right? So the ora serrata is that jagged line where the retina stops. So the retina goes from the ora serrata backwards and goes posterior from there, but it doesn't go any further forward. So from that point on, you're only seeing choroid, all right? Now, you have several chambers, which I think are going to be mentioned in upcoming slides. But basically, in front of the lens, you have a chamber that's full of watery fluid called aqueous humor. This is recycled like every 90 minutes. And it's recycled through the scleral venous sinus, which I don't have on the list there, and you don't have to know it because the charts and the models don't show it very well. But just to follow up on that momentarily, you manufacture aqueous humor in the ciliary processes, which I also don't have on your list because they don't show up very well either sometimes. But you manufacture, and then it drains through the scleral venous sinus. It used to be called the canal of Schlemm. But what can happen is sometimes that can get like clogged up, and then you have extra aqueous humor. And that's not a good thing because that puts pressure, it builds up intraocular pressure, puts pressure on your eye, and that can end up damaging your retina. It's a very dangerous situation, and that's what glaucoma is. So actually, I have a hiking friend who's a retired ophthalmologist, and that's mostly what she did for her surgeries. She did a lot of cataract surgery and a lot of surgery for glaucoma, and they basically just go in there with like a roto-rooter and make the scleral venous sinus bigger so it can drain the fluid, and then that takes care of the glaucoma. So again, some terms here. A lot of these we've already been over. Let's talk about, in general here, the anterior cavity. The anterior cavity is essentially the stuff that is in front of or at the side of the lens. All right. So in front of the iris is the anterior chamber. So that's between the cornea and the iris. That's full of aqueous humor. The posterior chamber is just a little tiny chamber. You can see it there. It's in between the iris and the lens. That's all full of aqueous humor. Then behind the lens is the vitreous chamber, and that's full of vitreous humor. Vitreous means glass-like. So this is a sort of a jelly-like substance that stays back there. Now the aqueous humor, like I said, you recycle that like every 90 minutes. The vitreous humor, you have that for your entire life. And we'll talk more about one of the consequences of that coming up. So when we look at the retina, there are two conspicuous spots. Now one of those spots is where all the axons of the ganglion cells all merge together and they form the optic nerve. Now that's sometimes called the blind spot. It's called the optic disc is the name I want you to use, but informally it's called the blind spot because you have no photoreceptors there. You have no rods or cones. You're not able to detect light at that spot, so you are technically blind there. And there are lots of cute little demonstrations. They have them in a lot of textbooks. I can't remember if your textbook has it or not. Or you can find your own blind spot. It's kind of cool. Look for those if you can find them. You like look one place and then you move the picture and then suddenly part of the picture, you can't see it anymore. You're going, oh my God, what happened? I've gone blind. No, you just moved that part of the picture so it fell on your blind spot. But it shows you very effectively that there is part of your retina where you can't see, all right? Now, sort of the opposite of that is the macula lutea. Macula means spot, lutea means yellow, so it's the yellow spot. This is where you have your greatest concentration of photoreceptors. This is where your vision is sharpest and clearest. And the very, very middle of the macula lutea is called the fovea centralis. Fovea, kind of another word for spot. So the fovea centralis is where you have absolutely the richest density of photoreceptors. So when you look directly at something, you're making that image fall on your fovea centralis. That's where you have your clearest. Notice how if you really want to see something clearly, you can see things out of the corner of your eye, as you call it, but you can't really see them all that clearly. If you want to see them clearly, you normally turn your head and you make the object fall directly. The light rays bouncing off of that object will then fall directly on your macula lutea and your fovea centralis. That's where you have your best vision. Here's another illustration showing really just all the same things, but now you can see the anterior chamber, anterior cavity, posterior chamber. See some bulbar conjunctiva. Now you see the aqueous humor being recycled there through the canal of Schlemm, the scleral venous sinus. So I don't think there's anything more here really to go over. Just another good view for you when you're studying so that you can see, a different angle for things. Let's start looking at the ear. So your whole ear is called the auricle, or the pinna. Both words get used. The little part where it bends over on the top is the helix, and the big earlobe is actually the lobule. I want you to use that word. We're using the technical names now. Once you get out of the class, call it anything you want. When you stick your finger in your ear, you are sticking it into the external auditory canal. Remember when we studied the bones, in the temporal bone there was the external auditory meatus. Well, once it's lined with skin, we call it the external auditory canal. It leads up to the tympanic membrane, which informally you call the eardrum, but for this class we have to call the tympanic membrane. That constitutes the outer ear, by the way. The outer ear runs from the tympanic membrane all the way out into the universe, okay? That's the outer ear. Next comes the middle ear. The middle ear has the three auditory ossicles, the Malleus, the Incus, and the stapes. It also has the auditory tube. Old-fashioned name is the eustachian tube. That goes down to your nasopharynx, which is the part of your throat that's in your nose. You may not have realized that, but yeah, your throat goes all the way up into your nose. Remember the kids in grade school that make milk come out their nose? Yeah, that's because it's all connected. The purpose of that, by the way, is to equalize air pressure, all right, so that the air in your middle ear will be the same pressure as the air in the outside world. This is why sometimes on airplane flights, little kids, with a cold, as you descend and the air pressure builds, they start screaming their lungs out because the pressure in their is pushing against their ear, and they can't equalize the pressure because their auditory tube is all clogged up with snot. Little kids always covered in snot. So malleus, by the way, root word hammer, incus, anvil, stapes, stirrup. So malleus is a bone that has a big club head on the end. And then, you know, blacksmiths, have you seen a blacksmith? You know, they pound the horseshoes. Well, they use the big hammer. What they're putting the horseshoe on is called the anvil. So the malleus, when the tympanic membrane vibrates due to a sound, it causes the malleus to vibrate, and it bangs on the anvil, the incus, and that wiggles the stapes. So the stapes fits into a little opening called the oval window, and the oval window goes into the vestibule. Ultimately, that's going to cause a wave of the air to get transformed into a wave of fluid. We'll see that coming up. So on top of the vestibule are the three semicircular canals, semicircular, half circle. We live in a universe that has three spatial dimensions, you know, height, width, and length, or you can use whatever terms you want for them, but there are only three spatial dimensions, and so we have a semicircular canal for each of the three spatial dimensions of our universe. One of them is called either anterior or superior. Either term is okay because it's the highest and the one that's most in front. There is one that lays on its side, that's the lateral, and then the posterior is the one that's left over, it's the one all the way in the back, okay? Then notice, see the spiral there? That's the cochlea. Greek root word means the snail. Doesn't it kind of look like a snail? So the whole inner part there is called the bony labyrinth. It's made up of both the vestibule, which has the semicircular canals, and the cochlea. The vestibule is for balance and motion, and the cochlea is for hearing, all right? And we'll see how that all works coming up. But notice that cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, has two branches. One goes to the vestibule, that's the vestibular branch. The other one goes to the cochlea, that's the cochlear branch. One's for balance and equilibrium, static equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium, motion, rotation. The other is for hearing, all right? And by the way, the round window, so the stapes wiggles in the oval window. It causes a wave of fluid to spiral to the center of the cochlea. Then the wave spirals back out and ends at the round window. So the wave of fluid starts at the oval window and it ends at the round window. It's kind of, you have to kind of have that. There has to be a place for the wave to end. There's a little membrane there that has a little bit of give in it so that the wave can neutralize out and stop. Okay, just a zoomed in view there. You can see the malleus with a big club-like head banging on the incus, stapes wiggling there in the oval window, and there's the round window. After the wave of fluid spirals to the middle of the cochlea, it spirals back out and ends at the round window. Notice also coming in, they show here the facial nerve. Both the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, and the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8, both go in and out through the internal auditory meatus, so they run right alongside of one another. Alright, so looking inside of the vestibule, there are two sacs, one called the saccule and the other called the utricle. So the utricle and the saccule have special little receptors for static equilibrium or balance, the simpler term. As we'll see in the physiology slides, you have little particles of calcium carbonate called otoliths, literally ear stones. And they're attached to a membrane, and there are some nerves that attach to that. So when you change the position of your body in space, the little ear stones fall in one direction or another, and that causes action potentials to be fired in the nerve cells. And that's how you know, damn, I'm about to hit that wall. You know, something happens a lot on Friday nights down on 4th Avenue, before the pandemic anyway. So, yeah, so those are inside of the vestibule. Then notice at the base of each semicircular canal is an ampulla. The ampulla has special little receptors in it for dynamic equilibrium. In other words, for rotation and motion. So the utricle and the saccule are for static equilibrium, just balance. You know, am I standing straight up? Am I leaning to the right or the left or forward or back? Whereas the little receptors in the ampulla let you know, am I moving? Am I moving forward? Am I moving sideways? Am I going in a circle? Whatever, all right? So we talk about static equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium, all right? So balance and motion. And that's what's going on there in the vestibule. Now, here we see if we take the cochlea and slice, we'll see that in each spiral of the cochlea there are actually three chambers. There's a chamber called the scala tympani, because that's one that goes directly to the tympanic membrane. Then there's the scala vestibuli, and then there's the cochlear duct, sometimes also called the scala media. I only have cochlear duct on your list. Then the helicotrema is basically a little opening where the wave can cross through from the scala tympani into the scala vestibuli. All right. Remember, the wave starts at the oval window, spirals to the center, then spirals back out through the scala vestibuli and ends at the round window. So helicotrema is the opening that allows it to pass through. That doesn't really show up in any charts and models. I have it on your list, but I will never ask you about it on a practical because we can't really see it anywhere. Okay, so take a look here. We're now zooming in. We see the scala vestibuli, we see the scala tympani, all right? And then in the cochlear duct, we see a little complex machine there, surrounded by that black rectangle. That used to be called the organ of Corti. It's now called the spiral organ. And that's really where hearing takes place. So let's zoom in on that right now. Here we go. Zoom, we're there. So the basilar membrane, which is connected to the scala tympani. Once again, when sound is nothing more than the movement of air. So the movement of air causes your tympanic membrane to vibrate. That vibrates the Malleus Incus, the stapes, into the oval window, causes a wave of fluid to travel through the scala tympani. That in turn causes the basilar membrane to vibrate. Now, what happens is that high-pitched sound will cause the basilar membrane to vibrate more at a different location than a low-pitched sound will cause. That will cause the basilar membrane to vibrate more at a different location. So that's how you can tell whether a sound is high-pitched or low-pitched. And the amount of vibration tells you whether a sound is soft or whether it's a loud sound, all right? So what happens is you have these hair cells. Stereocilia is the fancy name. I'm happy with hair cells. Those are connected to the basilar membrane. And they in turn have their little hairs that go up and contact the tectorial membrane. So when the wave of fluid vibrates, the basilar membrane vibrates, that causes the hair cells to vibrate. Then the vibration in the tectorial membrane is then transmitted to a nerve, to the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and that sends sound information to your brain. And that's how you know what you're hearing. And you say, you call me that again, I'll kick your ass, all right? See, that's how hearing works.